fellow Arizonan, or Zoni, as we used to be referred to as, Arizona native, worshipful brother Nathan Schick. Welcome to the Craftsmen Online podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I'm
It's
excited.
interesting. I wanted to spend a little time getting into the Arizona thing because, again, like I've never really had another brother from Arizona. I grew up in Yuma, or as President Bush referred to it as Yuma, Arizona, known for 310 to Yuma and a couple movies that are usually westerns. You, however, are in what, the greater Phoenix area?
I'm in the greater Phoenix area, and I'm the current master of Glendale Lodge number 23.
Nice. And then the other big difference between the two of us, and living outside of Arizona now, I get this all the time. Oh, you went to school in Arizona. You must be a Sun Devil. No, I'm not a Sun Devil. I went to Arizona, University of Arizona, bear down, proud Wildcat. I imagine you went to ASU, Arizona State.
I teach at Arizona State University. I'm in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies there, so I'm a proud Sun Devil. But I'm also a member in Scottish Rite in Tucson, so I do have some love for Tucson as well. So
Nice, nice. And we're brothers and friends, so all is good, but I just had to have that little Arizona banter
sure.
there. The other thing that's interesting looking at your bio, Brother Nathan is a master ritualist and a master lecturer under the Grand Lodge of Arizona. For those of us outside of that grand jurisdiction, can you tell us a little bit about those titles and what those roles are for you?
Yeah, they're really titles of service. They indicate that I've proven proficiency in all three of the Blue Lodge lectures for Master Lecturer and for all of the different ritual parts for Master Ritualist. So that in our jurisdiction, we have something like 20 or 25 guys who are Master Ritualists. And basically, once you've proven proficient in a lodge with your district deputy grandmaster seeing the work, then a panel of master ritualists comes together and they test the person to see their proficiency by just going through anywhere in the ritual, dropping a few lines and seeing if you can pick up the work from there, from memory and from floor work. And the idea being that it's a way to help support lodges that might need a little bit of ritual support, either in last minute situations or if it's a lodge, a smaller lodge, or in a rural area, they have a roster of brothers they can call upon to give that little bit of support to make sure the ritual quality stays at a high level. And so that's kind of the program we have in Arizona to make sure that there's ways to fill in the gaps in case there is some need at different lodges.
All right. So, for layman's terms, this is a brother who knows his stuff. And he's given this presentation several times. And he was fortunate. I'm fortunate enough that Brother Nathan shared his PowerPoint with me. And if you've tuned in for this topic, Moses, the fire bush, and the secret name of God, as a master mason, there was one word that was in there like, ooh, I want to learn more about this. But I want to start first at like kind of the main character here, Moses. And you and I were talking about this before I hit the record button. We do hear about him later on after the obligation part of the entered apprentice degree. However, it's part of that Masonic lecture where you just get Masonic education by fire hose. So if you're really not paying attention to the point where Moses is being described as the guy who led the Israelites out and parted the Red Seas, that may have gone over your head. What was the inspiration for you to do the research into this, and how much of the Moses origin story did you find parallel to what you had learned as an EA or even beyond?
Yeah, so I think that idea that what's the old phrase of this is a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. And so when I went through the degrees, I already was teaching in religious studies and was familiar with some of the biblical symbols and narratives. And so thinking about the illustration of symbols and which symbols really seemed rather important or seemed like they could be teased out to glean some kind of information, a little bit of background about the nature of these degrees and the kind of initiations that they were bringing upon different candidates as they went through them. For this particular story and the symbol, we see something really important that's described about us commonly with all lodges. The discussion, even though brief in the lecture, is that because of this miraculous east wind by which the mighty deliverance is wrought for the people, going from slavery to freedom, Moses erects a tabernacle to commemorate this east wind, which then is the orientation tied to the model for King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem later. That is the reason that we orient all lodges, east and west. And so that symbol, then, even though it's only brief, very short mention, we see that it's really important. It tells us something about who we are in the sense of why all of our lodges are set up the way that they are. And that idea goes back at least to Anderson's first constitutions. It's very prominently mentioned and tied with King Solomon's temple. So even to the earliest speculative period, we already see some of the mentions of the importance of this symbol. So even though it's brief, it's something that's rather important. And as you look at the story a little bit more closely, you see this model of communion or communication with the divine that is integral. It really is something that maps out an idea of how we can go from sort of the profane to the sacred, or we can go from sort of the outside world and approach the altar in a way that might be universal or at least very common.
And as we've shared many times on the podcast, Freemasonry is not a religion, but there are definitely a lot of biblical stories that are woven into the lessons that you'll hear in our degrees. We open with the volume of Sacred Law or the Holy Bible. On our altars, we have prayers. We bow to the name of God or deity or the supreme or great architect of the universe. It's interesting, though, because you had mentioned the Scottish Rite, and that kind of like stuck in my head. And as we hear this small part of Moses, which is before one of my favorite parts in the EA degree, which is the point within a circle, that tiny little paragraph that we get some of the deepest Masonic wisdom. That explanation of Moses leading people, kind of serving as the quote unquote foundation of building your Masonic symbolic temple. Did you find any connections, at least in the Scottish Rite, when it comes to the royal secret?
Well, yeah, so we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later on, but part of the model we see in the Blue Lodge degrees has to do with the notion of the lost word and
Mm,
the nature of the word being lost and what that might imply for us even today as a model for that idea of communion with the divine and a disconnect when we lose communion with the divine. And then when we look at the haute degrees, the so-called higher degrees, Royal Arch, and including within Scottish Rite, you get a model for how we might approach and eventually regain this kind of communion or communication, this regaining of the word in that sense. And Moses, in some of the degrees in Scottish Rite, features as a character, and we see the kind of ideas illustrated in the biblical narrative, but that also give us some kind of map or model by which this communion can be reestablished. Right? And so Moses has, as a character, brief mention maybe in Blue Lodge, but has a perhaps more prominent place in some of the high degrees, even as we experience them today.
All right. So you mentioned the lost word. Your presentation opens up with a review of the Regis manuscript. You talk about the Pigpen cipher, which I've literally only heard about one time during an investigation of an interested gentleman who asked me about it. And I'm like, I've never seen this before, but this is pretty neat. And then obviously learned more about it through him. But it's how Masons concealed, as you talk about the secret word. So to kind of kick things off here, why is having knowledge of the secret name of God important? What's the value to that?
Yeah, so again, if this is an analogy, right, we've got something that is veiled in allegory. So we're looking at this as some kind of analogy to an experience, something that's deeper. And so the reason that I start with the historic model that of Freemasonry that you see in the Regis manuscript and in the old charges, you see a couple of things. In the Regis manuscript, very inventive idea that Masons see a limitation, and it's caused by a major historic event. The plague takes place and wipes out half of Europe, and that includes skilled laborers. That includes the stonemasons who are skilled laborers. And as a result, the cost of labor goes up and there's a limit placed to try and limit the masons talking to one another about what the cost of labor for stone walls and cathedrals and castles is going to be. But the masons inventively in the Regis manuscript trace their lineage back to King Athelstan. And King Athelstan is the sort of founding figure of the kingdom, means that the aristocrats who are hiring these stonemasons are likewise tying their own lineage, their own authority back to Athelstan. So it means that because the Regis describes Athelstan as being a lover of Masons, a supporter of Masons, and giving them the right to meet annually wherever they choose, it means that if the people hiring them, the aristocracy of the day, says that they don't have this right, it undermines their own authority and their own lineage back to Athelstan as well. So, very brilliant kind of move that they place themselves within this kind of lineage. And the notion of lineages becomes really important. You see it in the Moses narrative. You see it also, though, for Masons, all the way through Anderson's constitutions and beyond. And so the idea here being that if they have the right to meet annually, a grand communication, it means that they can send one master of each working crew to meet at this annual communication, this grand communication, find out what the working conditions are, which people are hiring, what the cost of labor should be, disciplinary actions, all that kind of stuff. Um, but uniquely, around the early 1600s, there starts to be this reference to the Mason's word. And we see a variety of these references that are still existent. And they have this almost magical quality that people are kind of concerned about the Mason's word. It's caused a bit of a stir at first. And one of the descriptions about it is that they're able to communicate at a distance and cause each other to bring aid. They can help each other through this kind of whatever this secret word, this Mason word is. And so it causes this kind of stir throughout the 1600s, and you get an increasing number of references all the way up to the premier Grand Lodge in London's establishment. And so back to this annual or grand communication, in my book, I talk a little bit about it as sort of a play on words. We use this annual communication or grand communication as our meeting, but as a double entendre, it means our potential communication with the divine, a grand communication in that sense, right? So it's
Mm.
an allegory of sorts in that way. But what I posit here is that the Masons are able to communicate with one another after the annual communication, their grand communication. The masters go back to their working crews, and they've been given a word, a password of sorts, a kind of code word. With the Mason cipher, it's a very simple cipher system. Hashtag symbol, all the letters put into it, X for the remaining letters. You can even use it as a font in most word processors and write out your message that way. And it works without it being a code. Um, just as a little aside here that's maybe of interest, I know of one lodge in Washington, Esoterica Lodge, that uses the Mason cipher as an invitation to their candidates
Hmm.
for each of their degrees as a kind of way to get them in the mode of thinking about the cipher system, the Mason cipher, and things like that. So it's a really neat way to kind of make a little bit unique lodge culture that uses this historic uh, model of the Mason cipher.
Mm.
But the Mason cipher then, as a standard cipher, is easy enough. You just figure out the different letters. But if you use it with a password, let's say cat, CAT, is a cipher system. You pull out those three letters, CAT, and then you move all the letters as the regular cipher and put that password as the last letters. So that if you have the password, you can decipher the system and the message. If not, then it makes it much more difficult to decipher, and it would take you a lot more time. So that, in this operative period, if one master wants to send a message that they're not being paid, they're being poorly treated by someone, they can send that message with the code word to other masters, and whoever might, find the message won't be able to decipher it unless they have the code word. Right? So
Mm.
they can communicate at a distance safely and come to one another's aid. But it also implies something else kind of interesting, that let's say something happens that the master of each working crew suddenly dies during the year before the next annual communication. Any messages they might receive, the master's word has been lost and they won't be able to decipher it easily. So communication has been lost. And so, as an analogy here, if we lose the word, we lose communication. And in the sense of that, double entendre with the grand communication, we lose communication or communion with the divine if we lose the word. And so that's sort of the reason that I take a look at that kind of background and model as an allegory then for something larger, our own individual communion with the divine. And then when we look at the story with Moses, we see some kind of model for communion with the divine.
Mm. I love that you answered the question that way, especially the bullet points. I jotted them down here that the secret name, the master's word, the lost word, whatever you want to use, that it lends credence to for credibility, so that they could conduct commerce, basically, but also that they could communicate and connect with each other. It's less about the fact that, hey, I know the secret name of God, and now like Aladdin's genie, I could summon him to make him work for me because I know God's, because you can easily see those that didn't study the Bible and understand why that would almost be impossible as a human being to be able to pronounce that. But I love the way that you've explained that. I wonder how many brothers have come to your presentation thinking, oh, he's going to give us the secret name and explain what all of this means. Like, I'm going to be able to know God's name after tonight.
Right. And I think, in discussing that, we usually, in our question and answer and communication about that, talk about the fact that ultimately these are the mysteries of masonry, and that the ultimate secrets are incommunicable in a direct human to human way. That's the nature of the mysteries. That's what makes them so powerful and potent, that the true mysteries are, again, by allegory. We can give you a model that's similar, and hopefully then for each mason, if it is deeply impressed upon the mind, it then leads to the real communication that is ineffable. It's not something we can describe in that kind of direct way. So even though we're talking about this secret name, it's not like we can give it to you at the end for, the cost of admission and suddenly tell you, here's the secret name that you actually came for. Right?
Well, speaking of names, you're going to get to switch from brother hat to professor hat here, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to butcher this one. But when you get into your program, you shed a lot of insight into the biblical story of Moses, and we find him tending sheep and encountering the burning bush. And this is the location that I think I'm going to say it incorrectly, but is it Mount Horeb or Horeb?
Right. Right. Yep. Mount Horeb.
Whew,
Yeah.
got that one. Okay. um, in your presentation, what's the significance of this location? And what does the text about Moses's reaction to this wonder, what does that mean?
Yeah, so the story talks about Moses tending sheep in the wilderness, right? And he goes all the way to the other side of the wilderness to Mount Horeb, and which is described as the mountain of God. Right? So there's a sacred geography here for the people first hearing this story in antiquity, right? They know the lay of the land, so to speak, and they know some of the places that are being described. So it's very real, it's tangible in a sense for people in antiquity first hearing these stories. But even as kind of mythic geography, we can all imagine this idea of going through the wilderness and then being brought to a place that's a mountain, but is no ordinary mountain. It's the mountain
Mm,
of God. And so we can imagine even, sitting around the campfire, this story being told as an oral tradition, and people hearing, and then Moses goes through the wilderness all the way to the other side of the wilderness and comes to this mountain, the mountain of God. And the audience immediately knows, well, something big is going to happen here, obviously, right? It's epic, it's got gravity to it as a story. So in that sense, the geography, gives us lends to that part of the storytelling. But also, a little later on, God says to Moses, when Moses is feeling a little inadequate about his ability to convey sort of the message from God, God says that one of the signs that God is with Moses is that at a certain point, God will lead the people to the mountain and they'll worship God there. And that's how Moses will know God's with him. So the mountain also plays sort of an important role in the story in that sense, right? But just further, the notion of going through the wilderness and eventually coming to that place where communion is possible gives us a kind of model that we see in Freemasonry a little bit through the Blue Lodge degrees, the sort of chaotic nature of the degrees as you go from the profane outside world, outside of the Masonic temple, and then slowly but surely making your way to the altar.
Mm.
There's something there that's maybe akin in a kind of allegory of going through the wilderness before coming to that place where you might come face to face with the divine.
Yeah, and I could see why Master Masons are going to get a lot out of this program because Moses, when you think about it, his relationship with God or deity or the supreme architect, he kind of goes from being a seeker to becoming a servant or protector of God's people. And that's kind of part of the story that is being impressed upon us as Masons as we go from entered apprentice to Master Mason.
Right, and that process is not an easy one. Moses is very reticent, very hesitant to take on that kind of mantle, all the way to the point of effectively kind of angering the divine by saying that he doesn't think he's up to the task, but eventually becomes a servant along with his brother Aaron, and is able to cause a real transformation in his community and in history. And so I think for us, similarly, that knowing that that transformation is not necessarily easy, it's difficult, and there's work involved, hard work. That's sort of the notion of us laboring in the quarry and having that transformation take place from sort of the rough ashlar to the perfected ashlar is not going to be a smooth transition necessarily, but the model of Moses' story shows us the outcome that's possible.
Mm. What I love about presentations like yours, brother, is not only do you get into something that I'm like, ooh, love this. I get some historical relevance. I get some Masonic education, but I also get to expand my personal knowledge base. You introduced the concept of, and I'm going to turn to, Professor Nathan here. Is it Thea mania? Am I saying that correctly?
Right. So like theos, right, as God or divine, right, and
Okay.
mania, like mania, like madness. So theomania is divine madness, right? And so when we think of the story about Moses that comes from antiquity, from the ancient world, and how they're thinking about the potential for communion, for divine communion. Moses sees this wonder, sees this fire bush, this bush that's on fire but is not consumed, and hears a voice. And the voice says his name, Moses, Moses.
Mm.
And he responds, "Here I am." If today, I mean, you can think about this, in a contemporary setting, if you go out hiking with your friends, you see
Yeah.
a wonder, there's a bush burning, suddenly it starts talking to you and it says, "Nathan, Nathan." And I'm like, "Here I am." And my friends are with me and are like, "What's going on? You're hearing voices and you're talking back," right?
Mm.
You don't necessarily look at that as positive, as a good thing. In our contemporary society, we'd see that as clinical and as mental illness, as something not healthy, not good, right? We'd almost immediately describe it that way. But in antiquity, in the ancient world, that's not the view. And so when we look at Plato and the Phaedrus is where this is described by the character of Socrates of divine madness. And it's described very much as these are gifts. This is divine gifts. These are moments where the human is out of their mind. That's the
Hmm.
description being clearly given by Plato, but in a good way. It's an opportunity where the rational mind is kind of overcome so that some kind of real transformation can be initiated. So when we think of, initiations in this kind of way as a catalyst for real transformation, looking at the way that Plato describes this as a model in antiquity, there are ways of looking at divine madness in very positive ways. And it gives us a typology of these four kinds of divine madness and the gifts that they imply, the different kinds of gifts we get. You get, prophetic, as the Oracle at Delphi, very famous example of kind of foresight so that you can choose how you're going to behave, or policies for a polity to decide how they're going to move forward. So that's one kind of divine madness that would be a gift. You get initiatory divine madness connected with Dionysus, this kind of notion of within a ritual setting or mystic rites, a kind of overcoming of the rational mind for real transformation, in which theurgical rites and the like might real kind of divine communion in that sense. You get some that we're maybe a little more familiar with today, the poetic, that it's connected to the music. And so these are inspirational music, lyrics, that kind of stuff in antiquity, usually connected in with the Greek with wine, women, and song. But in contemporary time, with recorded music and rock and roll, we get drugs, sex, and rock and roll. I mean, the
Mm.
kind of divine madness in which we get lyrics and music that we appreciate and love, that when we look at the people who made that music, we would say they're out of their mind
Yeah.
on drugs or whatever, but they're
Right.
producing songs or lyrics or albums that we all love and that become classics. So we're
Mm.
familiar with that kind of divine madness. And then the last one that's described is erotic or love, eros, in that sense of romantic or sexual kind of madness, where a person falls madly in love and starts behaving very differently than they otherwise would because they've fallen for someone. But sometimes that's really for the best in their own personal life. They develop a relationship or something along those lines. So that kind of divine madness is potentially beneficial as well. So we see this typology that's given by Plato as examples of madness, but divine madness, that provide real gifts, real opportunities in which the person is out of their mind, but for beneficial things for themselves or their community. So in Greek, we get that sort of term of stasis and ecstasis. So,
Mm.
stasis in the sense of stability, and ecstasis outside of your normal mind and behaviors, that we get the term ecstasy that comes from that. So when we think of ecstatic rites and those kind of notions of moving one out of the regular form of mind for this kind of communion or divine madness that potentially brings these kinds of gifts. The question becomes, how do we know the difference between madness, just garden variety, being out of your mind, and divine madness? And the reason the story with Moses becomes interesting is it gives us a model or map in which Moses does something of a test, looks for proofs to see, have I just been out in the wilderness for too long? Maybe I'm dehydrated or something. I'm losing my mind.
Hmm.
Or is this actual communion, divine communion? This is divine madness that's actually bringing about communication that will be transformative. And so that's what's interesting about the story of Moses here, because the story shows that it is has some proofs to it and leads to real transformation for the community.
Mm. So one point you talk about the proofs is when he questions God about his name, and this is part of the when we talk about the secret name of God. And I've heard this in Blue Lodge, I've heard this in York Rite and Scottish Rite as well. As they all tried to provide explanation on further paths for the substitute word or other lost words that could possibly tie to deity. And one that I've heard that you mentioned in your presentation is the significance of I am as the name. Can you give our listener a little bit more on what that's about?
Yeah, I think first, just to back that up a little bit, that first interaction that Moses has when he hears the voice and he starts talking back with the fire bush, there is a moment there that the voice indicates something important for us. the voice says, pluck off your, come no further, pluck off your shoes, for the ground upon which you walk, even though it might look like regular earth, regular ground, is not. It's Kodesh. It's set apart. It's holy. We usually translate that as. And so in our Masonic ritual, then we have a very clear symbolic tie in there of if the ground upon which you walk, if you imagine it to be Kodesh or set apart, pluck off your shoes before you try approaching the divine to communicate, right? So that gives us a very clear cut sort of description of one sort of indicator there. The other part, though, then is that the voice says, with the generic term in Hebrew, El, God in that generic sense, like we use it in English with a capital G, this lineage, again, back to that notion of lineages. The voice says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So provides the right lineage, gives the right names, but doesn't use the name that is the secret name known only to the community. It's exclusive in that sense. It's protective. It makes sure that the people who know the name are true
Mm.
versus whether if this other sort of voice kind of indicates, well, I'm the god of this, that, or the other. How do you know that's true? Maybe that's true. Maybe you're just out in the wilderness too long and losing your mind, right? And
Right.
so there's this kind of back and forth where Moses says, well, that's cool and all, but if I go back to the Israelites and tell them I started talking to this wonder, this fire bush, they're going to say, yeah, maybe you've just lost your mind, just regular.
Mm.
And so there's this kind of response that Moses looks for. And the voice of the divine first gives this particular response that says, "Ehehia ashar ehehia." I am that I am. Tell them I am that I am is the one that you communicated with that sent you. This is one of the names of God that's been described and talked about a great deal over the centuries and is in some ways maybe best thought of in a mystical sense. It's
Mm.
very strongly indicating something about being. I am. There's a almost a indication that Moses knows by the very potency, the very majesty of the interaction that this is legitimate, this is real. Right? So that's the first part. But then it's that doesn't seem to satisfy, or at least the way that the story is told. Moses doesn't suddenly respond and say, "Okay, that's good enough for me." So the divine, the voice continues on, but that first voice, that first name is given as I am, and so that's the one of the names then that we get out of this particular communication.
Mm. You also mentioned he's got to kind of prove to others that he's not crazy, but he's crazy in a good way.
Right.
And now he's got to convince a bunch of people that, he has now gotten this authority. He now has this relationship. He has this connection now with a divine being. And he's got to convince the Israelites. He's got to convince the Pharaoh that he's not the guy who's just out talking to bushes in the desert and going nuts. And he does this through signs. And this is the part as a Mason where our ears perk up and we go, oh, signs. So what are these signs and what do they symbolize?
Right. So the follow up part with the communication of the names is that God says the secret name, the four-letter name of God, the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, and says not just God in the sense of El or the generic sense, says the name, the secret name, and that's sort of the proof positive, and says this will be the name down through the generations that God will be known by. Right.
Mm.
So we get the proper name given there. In the English translation, including to King James, the translation of that word is usually Lord, right? The Lord, rather than giving that secret name. But in history, in Jewish history, the development of the special name, the secret name, the four-letter name of God, becomes important for the development of practices at Solomon's temple. And so, by tradition, the notion is that only the high priest of Jerusalem will say this secret name of God, and only after the high holidays, the 10-day period kicked off from Rosh Hashanah, in which people um, have penitence. They make amends for the things that they've done over the past year. And then on Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, after everyone's atoned, gotten right with their neighbors, then and only then the high priest goes into the temple, and not just into the temple, into this one part of the temple that is the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the part that's set apart within the place set apart. So,
Mm.
completely separated from the profane world in that sense, and then says this secret name. And so, by conveying the name to Moses, this is sort of the moment where Moses sees this is the proof positive, this is the secret name. But even still, Moses knows and says to God, if I go back and tell them I heard the secret name, they're still not going to be convinced. They're going to just say, oh, so you heard the secret name when you were hearing voices out in the desert? Great. That doesn't mean anything. It just means you started hearing the secret name just like anything else. And so this is where the signs come into play. And these signs are a little bit strange when you see them maybe on the surface of the story. Usually, when I tell the story in person, I tie part of this to the Adam and Eve narrative in Genesis with the Garden of Eden, the serpent, and the eating of the forbidden fruit that leads to the covering. They realize their nakedness. God returns, and it's the first time, the only time in the biblical translations in the King James Version that uses the word apron. They
Mm.
wear it as a loincloth. And as a result, we wear aprons that are effectively covering one part of the body, right? So when we look here at the signs in the Mosaic story, um, I'll just say that in-person presentations, I talk about this more as euphemisms, the
Okay.
different parts as euphemisms. And so I guess I'll leave it to the listener's imagination to understand the symbols in that sense when we read it from maybe a surface level to the way that it can be read a little more subtly. So that kind of gives us maybe an indication here. But the first sign, God says, all right, we'll take your rod, now throw it on the ground, and it turns to a snake. It turns limp, right? Moses runs away. And then God says, all right, now take it by the root, take it by its tail. And all of a sudden it becomes rigid, it becomes stiff again, and it becomes a rod. And God's like, all right, there's the first trick. It's the first sign, right? And so that's one sign that's going to be an important one that they utilize, Moses and Aaron utilize, the sort of turning the rod to a snake or serpent becomes one of the signs. But God says, if that doesn't convince them, the second sign, now take your yod, your hand, and I'll just say the word yod in Hebrew is probably the most common euphemism for penis. And so there's lots of different stories in the Tanakh or Old Testament in which you can read it as yod or hand on one level. But if you read it again carefully, you see that there's something else being implied,
Mm.
and sometimes not very subtly, right? So here the story says, take your yod, now put it into your cloak, now pull it out, and it's going to turn completely white, like white as snow,
Mm.
right? Now, if it's your hand, you can understand why that might be a little bit concerning to the people, the Israelites, when they see this. If it's not just your hand, you can understand why it's maybe a bigger deal and more convincing to them of, oh man, we got to do something to
Right.
get this back to normal, right? And so,
Especially for the user himself.
right, right.
Yeah.
Like this is being given as an example to all of the people, and they're
Yeah.
going to very quickly be like, what do we got to do to get this back to normal, right? And then the third sign is take water from the Nile, pour it on dry ground, and it turns to blood, right?
Hmm.
So these three signs, then, you can read them on the surface as one sort of narrative. But I think if you read it as these kind of euphemisms, you get a different layer of the story that maybe helps to tie into the part of the story that comes immediately afterward, where Moses is traveling and he's nearly killed by God and that kind of stuff. There's some a little bit more explanation and understanding that comes when we look at the story from another level there.
Mm.
But
I
these
gotta say,
signs,
when
again, are meant to be proofs, right? That Moses isn't just going mad out in the wilderness. He's actually had real communication, and it's not just the word or name, but there are proofs that he can show as proof positive that this is real and it's real communication, and this is really a divine plan that's being put together.
While you're telling the story, I'm thinking of probably the most famous person I know that's demonstrated is Charleston Heston, and going through those things, and then he ends with "Let my people go." But now I'm thinking of, like, in the Bible, if you saw these things, we would think of it as magic in our minds, like this is unexplained, and it definitely would really jostle your own belief system and, like, what is going on here, how does this person have the powers to do this. It gets your attention, and it's kind of what this all means. As Freemasons, though, there, we're not giving any secrets away on the podcast. We've never been about that, but I'm sure there's a lot of brothers that are sitting here thinking, like, oh, okay, we talk about this in each of our degrees. We talk about the meaning of symbolisms and posture and why we stand this way and why this is done. And so much of our degrees is tied to stories and lessons in and from the Old Testament. This is all kind of making sense when we talk about the initiatic, the obligation part of our degree system.
Yeah, so to point out that idea that it might be magic and it looks like magic, in the narrative, when Moses and Aaron come before the court of Pharaoh, they perform these signs, and Pharaoh's, why is sometimes described as wise men, or they're described as magicians,
Mm,
as people doing the same kinds of things to see, well, can they match with their Egyptian knowledge of the unseen? Can they do the same kinds of signs? And they perform similar signs, but it also illustrates that the signs being shown by Moses and Aaron are greater by magnitude and are able to literally swallow up the magic that is being done by the Egyptian magicians. And
mm.
partly this is meant to show that things that might seem miraculous to us are possible through this kind of divine communication and this kind of knowledge and understanding of the divine plan effectively.
No, I'm sure I'm not the only brother who's heard you tell the story. I wish I'd actually got a chance to see your presentation or program, but I'm kind of coming to the conclusion here, and I'm sure you've gotten this question before. But do you kind of feel that maybe Moses was one of the original Freemasons?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on these lineages, like I said, that we described, all the way from the old charges through the constitutions of Anderson and beyond,
Mm,
always have a reference to Moses. And there is, in the description of the story itself, the Jewish people, the Israelites, are building with brick, and that's part of the story as well. And so, this notion that there is something about how Moses is leading the people and the connection to the lineage that's described always includes Moses as a part of this lineage. So we can see that Moses is at least a very important part of that lineage of the earliest of what we think of as Masons through time.
mm. This has been one of the most eye-opening episodes we've had this year on Masonic education. Really getting into exploring the ancient mysteries is what we're all about here on the Craftsman Online podcast. So, worshipful brother, I'm going to get you out of here with this question. Um, you've put a lot of yourself into this work, into this research, and thank you again for sharing it with us. What personally resonates with you about this story, and what are you kind of hoping our listener takes away from hearing this discussion tonight?
I think the fact that this story is so ubiquitous, it's so widespread in our society, that if you talk about the burning bush or Moses in the burning bush and the Passover and Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea, even if people aren't religious, they know some bits of the story. So that when you say the burning bush, even people who aren't religious, just as a part of our cultural literacy, will know that it's about divine communion, and a story of that divine communion taking place that's transformative, that changes history in a meaningful way. But I think most people don't pause to consider the experience, experientially, what that might be like to suddenly come upon a wonder and have divine communion, and how terrifying the awe, the awesome and awful, the majesty of that kind of experience of divine communion, and the feeling that Moses has of feeling inadequate, feeling rather small and incapable of playing a part in this plan and being able to act as a servant. And yet, in the story, there is a clear indication that God, through Moses and through cooperation with someone he trusts, his brother Aaron, is able to work together, that Aaron has some skills that Moses may not, and that together they're able to, with the understanding of the divine plan, cause real transformation in their community. And I hope that that idea that you might at times feel like you don't have the skills to cause real transformation by yourself in your neighborhood or in your community, for brothers, when you come to lodge and you see the other brothers there who do have other skill sets that you maybe don't possess, that together working on different projects in your neighborhood and in your community, you can cause great transformations to take place. And this story really gives us that kind of model for how that has taken place in the past that we can apply to our lives and to our lodges today. So that's one of the things I hope that, even though we talk about symbolism and history and some of these different connections, in a practical way, I hope that brothers see that particular connection and see it as applicable in their communities and in their lodges.
Awesome. Thank you again for opening up your program and just opening up your knowledge and sharing it with us. Worshipful brother Nathan Schick, I can tell you right now, you've given me another idea for a podcast. I want to talk about you with you soon and getting you back on. But for the time being, thanks so much for being a part of the Craftsman Online podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.